Next up is Chris. Thank you.
Hi. And we have a clicker. Hi, I'm Chris Woodfield, and I'm here representing the ARIN Advisory Council, and I'm bringing a topic about a potential change in ARIN policy that if you were a DNS or a Internet Exchange Point operator, you might have some opinions on. So let's get started. So if you're not familiar with the ARIN policy development process, here is the 60-second version. We start with a policy proposal, which is submitted by the ARIN community, and this is proposing edits to the Number Resource Policy Manual, the NRPM. The Advisory Council then evaluates that proposal, works with the author to resolve open questions, and once it is determined to be in scope and has a valid problem statement, we then promote it to what's called a draft policy, and that is where we seek community feedback, we accept language updates or language update suggestions, tighten up the policy text to make sure it addresses the problem statement, and then we gauge community support. Then we move to what's called a recommended draft policy, at which point this has to go through a staff and legal process. So ARIN staff and council evaluates the policy to make sure it is implementable, make sure it does not open up ARIN to any untoward legal liability and things along those lines. And then it's presented at an ARIN meeting. Once we have a good gauge of community support for the policy at that point, it goes to last call, which is more or less what you expect. It's a final notice period that I think is typically 15 days, I believe. And once that is over without objection, we recommend the policy for adoption. The board more or less checks our work, makes sure that we've gone through the process properly, and then takes a vote on whether or not to integrate the change into the Number Resource Policy Manual, at which point it takes effect. This proposal is currently in the draft policy stage. So we are still discussing it, we're still taking feedback, we're still workshopping adjustments to the language, and we'll be actively working on this until we believe we've got something that the community is happy with. So, on to the policy itself. This addresses section 4.4 of the NRPM, currently titled micro allocations. What this section allows for is smaller allocations to be made for what the policy calls core DNS providers and Internet Exchange providers, IXPs, along with allocations for ARIN and IANA's use. The origin of this policy comes back to when the minimum requestable block that you could get from ARIN was a /20. So the original desire was to allow for smaller requests for special purpose blocks of the types that mentioned here. Obviously, that is no longer the case, which is part of the justification for updating this policy. In the current policy, the definitions of core DNS provider and IXP are a little bit vague, and sometimes ARIN staff has to work to interpret those, and that's another motivation for bringing in this policy and this update to tighten up that language as well. Examples of a DNS provider would be, in the current language, it shows examples of an ICANN sanctioned provider and CCTLD providers, but not exclusively so. So this proposal, this draft policy, is a rewrite and a renaming of section 4.4, which was proposed by members of the ARIN community. As I mentioned, this is currently in draft policy, and there's a URL so you can read the complete text of the proposal. So feel free to download the slide and take a look, or just Google for ARIN-2024-5, and that'll take you right to it. You'll notice this policy is named 2024-5, and that means it was originally proposed in May 2024. That is not unusual. We have policies that kick around for quite a while, and that's a good thing. We'd much rather overcook the policy than let something half-baked go into the NRPM and have it affect the community in ways that we didn't expect. So what does the policy do? First off, it renames the 4.4 section to critical internet infrastructure allocations, because the 24 is no longer micro at this point in IPv4 world. It clarifies requirements for DNS providers and IXP operators, and puts tighter language around what needs to be done in order to qualify as one of those categories to receive space under this policy. It also addresses some questions about whether or not CIA space can be routed by an IXP. The prior policy was silent on that, and the original intent was that it was not supposed to be routed because it's an IXP block, but a number of requests have come in and to make that space routable, and ARIN staff has had to field those without much guidance from the policy itself. So we put in some updates for that as well. So for DNS providers, like I said, the policy refers to core DNS server providers, without really much guidance on what that means other than providing for examples. The current form of the draft policy text allows for most root and TLD operators, GTLD, CCTLD, and some others, to request 4.4 space. The intent here is to allow, again, most TLD providers, but to exclude what we call, the so-called vanity domains, where a company may register their own TLD with ICANN, pay that fee, and then only use that for their own branding or their own resources. I'm sure y'all can think some examples there. There is ongoing discussion with the community on the best choice of language to effectuate this. So PPML comments are welcome, or PPML or any other means comments are welcome for this. If you are an IXP operator looking to get space under this section, again, we've clarified some requirements. There's some additional documentation that needs to be provided in order to qualify. The big one that changes is that you need to be able to provide full information about the initial participants. You need a minimum 3. That's no different than current policy. The 3 participants must be unaffiliated. If you have one member participant that is a subsidiary of the other, they only count as 1, not 2, to meet the minimum 3. It allows for additional requests for CII if your IXP grows. If you need a second 24, you can go back and request that. And as I mentioned before, it explicitly allows a space to be routable, but restricts the usage of that space to necessary IXP functions. What is a necessary IXP function? Well, let's talk about that in a couple slides out. So here are the open discussions we have. One, does it make sense to expand the CI access to commercial DNS operators beyond the root and CCTLDs? If so, what's the best language to capture this? That's an ongoing discussion, and some talk about, okay, do we really need to capture that in this policy? Could we cover the redefinition of that part of the policy in future proposals instead of trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone in this one? There's been some discussion of whether or not the proposed requirements for IXP operators might be too strict. We've heard that feedback from a couple IXP operators. There's also been a mention of we might have a chicken and egg problem where a IXP has to have a running network to say they have participants, but they need the space to get those participants. So we need to figure out how to make sure that gets clarified as well. Next open question that we got is that if the IXPs can route CIA space, can it be used for IXP business unrelated to the traffic exchange on the exchange? We've had questions about, can we put can the IXP's website run out of that space? Can the IXP put a looking glass, a customer portal, monitoring, other publicly accessible resources in the same space that they use for the IXP traffic exchange? That's an ongoing discussion. One more is that given that IXPs will always need contiguous space, if they make an additional request, they can't just get a second 24. They need to get a 23, renumber in, then return the other /24 back. If that's the case, how much time do we give them to do that renumbering? I've heard recommendations from 30 days to 2 years, so finding something in the middle would be a great thing to get some feedback on. If you want to tell us what you think, there's a number of avenues. This is not an exclusive list, but the ARIN PPML mailing lists is ARIN's official gauge of community support outside of the meetings themselves. When the board evaluates the policy at the end of the PDP, that's one of the things they look for is comments in the PPML. We have a public policy meeting coming up in October. That is immediately after the October NANOG, so come and talk to us there. And there's a few of us here. There's several members of the AC, so leverage the so-called NANOG hallway track. And we'd like to know what you think. Thank you very much, and let's go on to the next speaker.